It had rained for hours that evening, the kind of slow, unhurried rain Oxford reserves for the undecided and the lonely. I remember walking by the river, collar up, the mist curling like breath from a sleeping city. The bells of Magdalen drifted through the air, hesitant, slightly out of rhythm, as if reluctant to mark another passing hour. I'd been trying to finish a bottle of indifferent claret and failing, which, for me, is a measure of something being amiss. I'd left the office early, with no case to speak of. Lewis had gone to see his sister in Banbury, and the city seemed to fold in on itself the way Oxford does when term ends and the students scatter, leaving behind their ghosts. I walked, without purpose, past locked college gates, under windows that glowed like fragments of thought. Somewhere, a piano practiced a fugue badly, stopping just short of coherence. I've always had a fondness for imperfection. It's the only thing that feels human. I ended up, as I too often did, at the Trout, though the place was empty save for a man asleep against his pint. I sat near the window, listening to the rain gnaw the river's surface. There's something in that sound, a quiet insistence that nothing ever really ends, that all our tidy conclusions dissolve into repetition. I thought of a woman I once knew, though not for long, and wondered whether she still attended evensong as she had promised she would. I doubted it. It must have been close to midnight when I returned to Jericho, the rain having eased to a damp whisper. I switched on the wireless. The announcer, in that unctuous BBC voice that manages to make both births and bombings sound equally unremarkable, mentioned a brief news item. A visiting academic, Dr. Helena Bryce, had collapsed during the evening service at St. Frideswyde's College. Apparent heart failure. Nothing more. A pause, then a cheerful segue into the shipping forecast. Apparent heart failure. The phrase lodged itself in the mind like a pebble in the shoe. Not cardiac arrest, not coronary thrombosis. Apparent heart failure. Such words are chosen carefully by those who prefer not to be questioned. I'd read enough post-mortem reports to know the language of evasion when I heard it. The next morning, I bought the Oxford Mail from the kiosk on Broad Street. The headline was small, almost apologetic, tucked between a road closure and a charity concert. The report added little Dr. Bryce had been attending a seminar on memory and moral responsibility. She had been found by the dean shortly before the final hymn. The coroner would, of course, determine the cause. There was no suggestion of foul play. That phrase again, no suggestion, Oxford's favorite alibi. I sat at my desk, the paper folded neatly beside the crossword. The clue at the center caught my attention, peal of remorse. 5. I remember staring at it for longer than necessary. Bells again. Everything seemed to ring that morning, though softly, as though the city itself were clearing its throat before a confession. I didn't fill in the answer. Not yet. Later that day, I took the car towards St. Frideswyde's. Rain had returned, thin and metallic, hissing against the windscreen. The college stood behind its high walls, its tower leaning slightly like a listener bending toward a whisper. Through the gates, I glimpsed the chapel, small, gray, dignified, and a porter polishing brass with excessive concentration. I asked whether visitors were permitted. He hesitated, then said the dean was not seeing anyone, though he did not ask who I was. I took that as an invitation of sorts. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and damp hymnals. I stood where the choir must have gathered, looking up toward the bell tower. There were 6 bells, if I remembered correctly, though one had been silent for years after a crack. Still, someone had rung it last night. The porter had said so in passing. Bells that ring when they shouldn't, hearts that fail apparently, and words that conceal more than they declare. Oxford, in its infinite civility, never changes. When I left, the rain had stopped, leaving the flagstones dark and shining. I heard the faint echo of my own footsteps beneath the tower and thought, absurdly, that they did not sound like mine at all. Perhaps memory does that, reshapes the sound of things until even one's own life feels like someone else's recollection. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and opened the crossword again. Peal of remorse. 5. I wrote softly in the square, almost as if it were a confession rather than an answer. The word fits too well to be a coincidence. The porter's hesitation lingered with me longer than his words. St. Frida's Wides was a place that had mastered the art of silence, and silence, I've always thought, is rarely innocent. The rain had stopped when I returned that morning, though the stones still gleamed like wet parchment. There's a certain type of college light-muted, patient, slightly jaundiced that seems to have learned the value of discretion from centuries of gossip. Lewis met me by the gate, looking uncomfortable, his shoes damp from puddles. He told me the dean would see us, though not gladly. We crossed the quad in uneasy companionship, our footsteps clicking against the flagstones like punctuation marks in an unfinished sentence. The bell tower loomed above us, its clock hand pausing between times. Inside, the college smelt of beeswax, paper, and dust, warmed by the sun through old glass. Corridors turned like questions without answers, each lined with portraits of men whose achievements had long since been overtaken by the patience of their own frames. The dean's study was at the far end, an oak-panelled chamber where light moved slowly across the spines of unread books. He rose to greet us, urbane and courteous, though his smile faltered halfway to sincerity. He spoke in those careful tones one reserves for small scandals. He regretted Dr. Bryce's death, of course, such a tragic occurrence. But one must accept the limits of mortality, especially in those who lived alone and worked too hard. He said it was heart failure again, as though the repetition might turn fiction into fact. I asked him about the seminar Dr. Bryce had been attending. Memory and moral responsibility, he said, an interdisciplinary indulgence. The topic had attracted visiting scholars, a few old friends of the college, and some younger academics still learning the art of envy. While he talked, I glanced at the papers on his desk. They were arranged too neatly. One envelope lay half-covered by a blotter, the corner of its seal broken but never opened. My eyes drifted to a notice board near the window, a small square of paper pinned among timetables and choir rosters. A verse from Donne, though misquoted. "Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Except it didn't. It read, "Ask not for whom the bell tolls for them," a grammatical sin committed by someone educated enough to know better. The dean followed my gaze and smiled with mild condescension. "A relic of the chapel committee," he said. "Perhaps a student's mistake." I told him I disliked errors that pretended to be accidents. His smile tightened. When we left, Lewis remarked that I was in one of my moods. Perhaps I was. But moods have their uses. Outside, the porter who had turned me away the night before was polishing the brass again, his rag moving in circular motions like someone trying to erase thought. I asked him quietly about the bell that had rung out of sequence. He looked up, startled that I knew. He muttered that one of the bells had sounded at 1:15 when it should not have. Said it was probably the wind or the mechanism sticking. Bells, like people, have habits. They do not often break them without reason. We crossed the quad again. From an upstairs window, I thought I saw a curtain shift the faintest tremor of fabric. A watcher unsure whether curiosity outweighed caution. I filed the image away. Oxford has more eyes than it admits. Before leaving, I stopped by the guest register. A fresh entry had been erased recently, the ink washed thin by damp sponge work. Only the indentation remained something that might once have been a B or an R. Lewis said it could be anyone. He was right, of course. But it could also be someone who preferred not to have been here at all. The bells began to ring as we stepped through the gate, the sound diffused by low clouds. It wasn't the full sequence, 2 notes missing, as if the tower had forgotten part of its own language. I remember thinking that grief expresses itself in omissions far more eloquently than in excess. That night, I noted a single line in my notebook. Out of sequence bells, misquoted verse, erased name, 3 small errors, or perhaps 3 whispers in the same tongue. It was Lewis who found the photograph. He'd been sorting through Dr. Bryce's possessions in the college's guest room, a task I had delegated with an ease that surprised even me. There is something indecent about rummaging through the remnants of a life interrupted, but Lewis, with his unvarnished decency, managed it without complaint. He handed me the photograph later that afternoon, his fingers leaving faint traces of damp on its curled edges. 4 figures stood before the same bell tower we'd passed that morning, young, careless, and unknowing of the weight that time would place upon them. I recognized the dean at once. His face was thinner, his eyes less guarded, but it was him. Beside him, a woman I did not know, though she carried the same stillness I'd seen in Dr. Bryce's photograph from her passport file. And to the left, a man holding a notebook, his smile broad, faintly reckless. The 4th figure was obscured, half in shadow, half by the edge of the print, as though reluctant to belong. Lewis suggested it might be a college reunion of sorts, perhaps from 20 years ago. I nodded, though my mind lingered on the architecture in the background. The stonework newly restored then, the scaffolding faintly visible. That placed the image between 1968 and 1970. I remembered reading about a restoration grant to St. Fritzwide's around that time, funded by an anonymous benefactor. There was a faint echo between the past and the present that refused to quiet itself. We returned to the dean's study that afternoon. He received us with a tolerance bordering on weariness, a man who considered interruption a moral offense. I placed the photograph on his desk without a word. He looked at it only briefly before turning his gaze to the window. I could tell by the stillness of his hands that he recognized it instantly. He said something about how long ago it had been, how people change, how photographs lie. I replied that they rarely do it, is memory that performs the deceit. He told us the man with the notebook was a poet, Arthur Latham, who had lectured at the college for a year before vanishing from Oxford life altogether. The woman beside him was Helena Bryce herself, then a newly appointed fellow at Somerville. They had all worked together on a committee of moral philosophy, which, given the current circumstances, struck me as darkly comic. I asked about the 4th figure. The dean frowned, said he couldn't recall. I believed him, though not for lack of memory, but of will. Afterwards, Lewis and I walked through the cloisters. He was quiet, sensing perhaps that my thoughts had turned inward. The air smelt faintly of rain and wax polish. I remember pausing beneath the bell tower, looking up into the hollow space that seemed to gather sound rather than release it. The photograph had been taken from this very spot, the angle unmistakable. I traced the stonework with my eyes, noting the patch where restoration had replaced decay. It was crude work, too light in tone, too deliberate in its cleanliness. A forgery of age, I thought. Later, back in my room, I poured myself a whiskey and spread the photograph on the desk under the lamplight. The surface shimmered faintly where time had lifted the gloss. I noticed then something Lewis had, not a detail so small it might easily have escaped notice. The man with the notebook Latham was holding a pencil, not writing, but drawing. His thumb smudged the edge of what looked like a bell, roughly sketched, shaded dark at the base. Beneath it, a faint inscription, half visible in the enlargement I made later, "Peal reversed." That phrase had been circling me for days. The porter's tale of bells ringing out of order, the crossword clue about remorse, the misquoted dawn pinned in the dean's corridor. Oxford thrives on coincidence, but even the most civilized coincidences can become too tidy to ignore. When the evening bells began to sound, I listened with deliberate attention. The sequence faltered again, 5 notes instead of 6, the missing chime where silence entered like an afterthought. I wrote a single sentence in my notebook before turning out the light. A photograph remembers what people try to forget. The whiskey remained unfinished. Lewis never liked the university cases. He said once, half-jokingly, that Oxford seemed to breed more motive than decency. Perhaps he was right. The following morning, I sent him back to St. Fritzwide's to conduct what the college liked to call informal conversations. I knew what that meant: doors left half open, answers wrapped in propriety, and an undercurrent of fear disguised as courtesy. When he returned, his notebook was filled, though I doubted much of it would stand the test of light. He told me that the dean had been polite to the point of rudeness, the bursar evasive, and the chaplain eager to offer sympathy uninvited. But there was one small remark that held my attention. The choir mistress, a woman of indeterminate age and formidable posture, had said that Dr. Bryce had been trying to bring daylight into places that preferred candlelight. Lewis had written the phrase down without comment, though it pleased me that he had recognized its shape. Later that afternoon, we returned together. The quad was unusually still, a few scattered students passing through with the distracted haste of those who suspect the world of existing elsewhere. The chapel doors were open, a faint echo of scales from the organ loft drifted down like dust. I told Lewis to find the bursar while I lingered in the nave. The choir mistress appeared beside me as quietly as guilt. She spoke of the acoustics, of how sound in that chapel could deceive even trained ears. A voice, she said, could seem to come from one side when in fact it rose from another. She smiled faintly, as though she were describing human nature itself. I asked whether she'd noticed anything peculiar the night Dr. Bryce died. She shook her head, but hesitated just long enough to betray thought. Then she said, almost absently, that she'd heard one bell strike before the others, as if the tower were impatient. She supposed it must have been the mechanism catching on the wet. Lewis found me soon after with a file from the bursar's office. Dr. Bryce had been reviewing the accounts of a small endowment fund, the St. Fritzwide's Memorial Scholarship, established decades ago to support students of limited means. The records stopped 2 years ago. The bursar, when pressed, had blamed clerical confusion during the transition to a new system. I had heard that kind of confusion before. It usually meant someone had profited from its persistence. We went together to the library, a long, narrow room that smelled of vellum and fatigue. The light through the stained glass was dim, as though it, too, had grown tired of the college's secrets. On one of the reading tables lay a register of visitors, dusty, seldom used. I turned the pages slowly. Most were blank. The few signatures that appeared were deliberate, exact, the handwriting of people accustomed to leaving a mark without meaning to. Lewis pointed out that one of the last entries was in the dean's hand. I noticed that the date coincided with the week before Dr. Bryce's arrival. Beneath it, in a darker ink, someone had written a Latin phrase, vox dormiens, non audit campanam. The sleeping voice does not hear the bell. I couldn't tell whether it was a warning or a benediction. Outside, the evening light was withdrawing into grays. Lewis walked beside me in silence, content to let my thoughts move unspoken. He asked, finally, whether I believed in coincidences. I told him I didn't, but that Oxford did, provided they were cloaked in enough Latin and gilt. At the gate, I turned to look once more at the bell tower. Rain had begun again, tapping lightly on the lead roof. The sound mingled with the soft hum of organ practice, a single sustained note that trembled before resolving into silence. I felt, rather than thought, that the truth was already there somewhere between the missing scholarship and the mistimed bell waiting for the right ear to hear it. That night, I wrote in my notebook that bells deceived me. but only if someone teaches them how. I've always believed that what is absent tells us more than what remains. That morning proved it. Lewis had brought Dr. Bryce's diary to my flat in a plastic evidence bag as though guilt could be quarantined. The pages were densely filled tight, cursive handwriting that gave the impression of restraint rather than passion. She had written as a woman who feared indulgence, or perhaps as one who could not trust the permanence of thought. Near the end, the entries faltered. Dates grew irregular. The last complete one described a meeting with the dean cordial, professional, and, as she noted, without resolution. Then a blank space, followed by a jagged tear. The final page had been removed cleanly, as though with deliberation rather than haste. I ran my thumb along the edge and felt the precision of the cut. Not a nervous hand, then. Someone who knew how to finish a sentence, even when destroying it. Lewis suggested she might have torn it out herself, perhaps. But people rarely erase the truth when they mean to conceal it. They erase when they hope someone will notice the absence. The human equivalent of a bell ringing off-key. We went to her lodgings near Banbury Road Room, small enough to feel borrowed. Books everywhere, but ordered with mathematical care. Greek poets beside criminal law, theology beside pharmacology. On her desk stood an open letter, the ink faintly smudged by a drop of water or perhaps a tear that had changed its mind. It was unsigned, written in a slanted hand, quoting Browning. The bells must ring to warn, not mourn. I folded it carefully and slid it into my coat. There was also an ink stain on the blotter, dark and circular, as though she'd rested her pen too long in thought. It formed, if one looked closely, the vague shape of a bell. Coincidence, of course, but Oxford is built on coincidences that refuse to behave as such. Outside, the day was clear and dry, a rare thing, and it made the college spires appear almost indecent in their sharpness. Lewis spoke of lunch. I told him I preferred to eat after a revelation. He muttered something about my stomach being less patient than my intellect, and left me to my brooding. I went to the Bodleian instead. There, in the hush of the upper reading room, I requested the register of college correspondences from the year the scholarship fund was first endowed. The librarian, a woman with the pallor of parchment, brought the volume reluctantly, as though I'd asked to disturb the dead. Among the neat Latin entries, one name reappeared, Arthur Latham, poet, guest lecturer, beneficiary of a forgotten trust. His connection to the college had ceased abruptly 20 years earlier. The entry beside his final appearance bore a small cross, as though someone had marked it for remembrance or repentance. When I returned to St. Fridswide's that evening, the chapel was empty, save for a single candle burning on the altar. The choir mistress had left her spectacles on a pew. I picked them up, more from curiosity than courtesy. A small smear of ink stained the right lens. Not unusual, perhaps, but the same blue shade as the ink in Dr. Bryce's diary. Lewis joined me a few minutes later with a post-mortem update. Digitalis had been detected in her bloodstream dosage consistent with medicinal use, yet enough to unbalance the heart under strain. He said the coroner leaned toward natural causes. I said I didn't. The body always tells the truth, but only if you ask the right question. Before leaving, I climbed to the organ loft. The floorboards creaked in protest, and the air smelled of varnish and decay. From there, I could see the bell ropes hanging like severed threads. One was frayed near the base, the fibers darkened by something more than dust. Oil, perhaps, or ink. I ran my fingers over it and felt the faint tackiness of residue. Someone had touched it recently. When the evening bells began, I listened for the sequence. It faltered again, just as before, one note late, another withheld entirely. I thought of the missing diary page, the ink-stained spectacles, the erased scholarship. All pieces, each one sounding its absence louder than any confession could. That night, back at my desk, I wrote 2 words in my notebook before closing the page. Then, beneath it, as though answering myself, but not lost. The coroner called it heart failure brought on by stress and a medicinal imbalance. A neat conclusion, like the final chord of a hymn that pretends at peace. I should have been content Lewis was, but I've never trusted harmony. It's a word composers and liars use interchangeably. That afternoon, I found myself once again within the walls of St. Fridas Wides. The sky was overcast, the air tasting faintly of copper and old rain. The chapel doors stood open for choir practice, and the sound rose like incense measured, faultless and wrong. Even before I knew why, I felt a tension between notes, the faint dissonance of human deceit disguised as devotion. Lewis joined me at the back. He said the post-mortem had confirmed traces of digitalis in the bloodstream, but that the dosage was inconclusive. Perhaps accidental, he offered, though his tone betrayed doubt. I told him nothing about my growing conviction that the bells, the choir, and the death were somehow joined by more than coincidence. I have learned not to share a theory until it's already halfway to proof. After rehearsal, I approached the choir mistress again. She was polite, tired, her smile the sort that ends sentences rather than begins them. I asked about Dr. Bryce's involvement with the music of the service. None, she said, though she had once requested a particular hymnogord, our help in ages past, and they'd sung it for her that night. I asked why that hymn. She didn't know. I thanked her and left, but something in her tone lingered. A faint flicker of guilt, perhaps, or recollection. She had said the hymn title quickly, too quickly, as though she'd practiced saying it aloud to herself. When I returned home, I opened the hymn book from my own school days. The 6th verse rarely spoke of time's relentless witness. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone. A line about eternity disguised as comfort. I wondered whether Helena Bryce had known she was dying, or merely feared she might. That night I sat at my desk, the radio murmuring a late Beethoven sonata in the background. The slow movement, adagio molto semplice, has always struck me as the sound of someone trying not to cry. The melody breaks, then pretends to heal itself. False harmony again. I examined my notes. The scholarship fund, the erased ledger, the letter quoting Browning. The bells are striking wrong. Each detail seemed discreet, yet all followed the same rhythmic pattern of misdirection. People had been silenced politely. Here, the dean with his immaculate phrasing, the bursar with his vanishing figures, the choir mistress with her half-truths. Oxford specializes in erasing sin under a coat of varnish. Lewis phoned to say the bursar had left town suddenly, claiming illness. I asked where. Bournemouth. I told him to confirm. When he hesitated, I added that seaside air does wonders for the guilty heart. Later, I returned to the chapel alone. The caretaker let me in reluctantly, muttering about rules and respect. Inside, I walked to the organ loft, the boards sighing underfoot. Beneath the keys, a small scrap of paper caught my eye, a folded program from the night of Bryce's death. On it, in blue ink, was a faint circle around one word in the hymn list evensong. I could not say why, but it filled me with unease. As I left, I paused beside the bell ropes again. One was shorter than the others, newly cut and retired. Its end glistened slightly with oil. I touched it and felt the faint drag of residue. Someone had altered it recently, perhaps, to change the chime's timing or its sound. Back outside, the bells began again, the same pattern as before, except this time the missing note returned. The tower sang its full measure, yet it felt hollow like an apology rehearsed too late. I listened until the echo faded into the rain. When I reached home, I poured a whiskey and stared at the crossword from the Times. The clue read, sound without sense. 7. I smiled without mirth and filled in the answer before folding the paper away. Bellend. Crude, perhaps, but apt. Oxford's most elegant crimes are always committed in the name of sound that hides silence. It was Lewis who found the poem. He brought it to me, folded into thirds, as though afraid that by opening it he might release something best left dormant. He'd discovered it tucked inside a back issue of the Oxford Review in the college library, a thin volume that still smelt of dust and neglect. He said it looked like nothing. I told him most of Oxford's crimes did. The poem bore no title, only the initials AL at the end. It was printed anonymously, written in the language of someone who had lived too long among footnotes. The first stanza spoke of bells rung backward, of time seeking forgiveness, of a voice stilled by its own echo. The rest was more personal, though couched in classical allusion as a scholar betrayed by his own hand, a woman whose virtue was measured in silence, a sin disguised as duty. Lewis asked whether I thought it was about the dean. I said it was about someone who could no longer tell the difference between confession and composition. But I knew he was right. Beneath its ornamentation lay a story I recognized, and a voice that seemed to murmur from somewhere behind the college's polite facades. We took the poem to the dean that afternoon. He read it quickly, his eyes narrowing only once, at the phrase "peal" reversed to "unmake sin." When he finished, he set it down with theatrical calm. He told us it was meaningless student drivel, or perhaps the work of that same Arthur Latham who, he said, had always preferred verse to truth. The dismissal was too smooth, too ready. I asked when he had last heard from Latham. He said never, though the word came too late, like an echo that had to be forced. Outside, the air was brittle with rain. Lewis walked beside me, silent in that loyal way he has when he suspects I'm assembling thoughts I don't yet wish to share. I stopped beneath the tower. The bells hung motionless above us, the ropes limp and wet. I told him that Latham's poem was more than nostalgia. It was a record. The detail about the reversed peal struck me most. To ring a bell backward, you must alter its rhythm deliberately. It changes the meaning of sound, transforms ceremony into signal. I'd heard that distortion once before on the night of Dr. Bryce's death. That evening I returned to my room and poured a whiskey. The poem lay on my desk beside the crossword. The clue read, "Backwards Confession 5." I smiled at the coincidence and filled in the word repel. It fit too neatly, as if the universe itself had begun to play along. I reread the poem slowly. In the fourth stanza, a line I'd overlooked before began to insist on itself. One rang the bell to hide the hour. One heard the silence twice. A double meaning, I thought. The first bell evensong had been used to fix a time of death. The second, its echo, had been meant to erase it. A false alibi constructed in verse. Whoever had written it had not only known the crime, but composed it as poetry. The next day, Lewis reported that the bursar had returned suddenly from Bournemouth, claiming he'd found new documentation proving that the scholarship fund was intact. His tone, he said, had been defensive, almost rehearsed. I asked whether he'd mentioned Dr. Bryce. "Only once," Lewis said, calling her unwise. A word that, in Oxford, covers everything from adultery to idealism. Before night fell, I walked once more through the college grounds. The rain had stopped, but the stone still held its memory. Through an open window in the chapel, I heard the choir rehearsing the same hymn they had sung the night she died. Their voices were pure, balanced, and chillingly precise. I listened for the bells to follow, but they did not. As I turned away, I thought of the line from Latham's poem again. One heard the silence twice. The first silence perhaps belonged to Elena Bryce. The second, I suspected, was only beginning. There are moments in investigation when everything fits too well, like a crossword solved too quickly, every word obedient, every clue obvious. It was that neatness that first made me uneasy. By then, I had built a serviceable theory. The choir mistress. She had opportunity, intelligence, and a motive shaped by sentiment and fear. Her over-the-dean perhaps risked exposure through Bryce's research into the missing endowment. The poison could have been administered easily. Enough! The evensong schedule manipulated. The reversed bells were her signal or her cover. Lewis thought it all perfectly reasonable, which in retrospect should have been my first warning. We questioned her in the cloisters, where sound carries softly, like regret. She did not deny knowing Bryce well. They had corresponded, she said, about music, about ethics, about the peculiar consolation of both. When I mentioned digitalis, she hesitated only briefly before replying that she'd kept the drug for her mother, who suffered from an irregular heartbeat. The bottle, she admitted, had gone missing recently. I noted the admission and the absence of alarm. Guilt often trembles innocence, sometimes rehearsing calm. Afterwards, Lewis and I walked along the North Quad. The bells began to toll again, and I found myself counting the intervals without meaning to. They were perfect now, precise, faultless, and mechanical. The symmetry of it disturbed me. Lewis said she was the one, that I'd known it from the start. I didn't answer. Something about her composure struck me not as defiance, but as despair. That night, in my flat, I poured a whiskey and stared at the case files spread across the table. The papers formed a pattern I could almost believe in. The missing scholarship explained the motive. The poison explained the method. The bells provided the means. But a small, irrelevant question refused to die. If she had rung the bells to disguise the time of death, why had the sequence faltered twice? Once before, and once after the night in question. No one maintains a lie that consistently without purpose. I returned to St. Fridwide's the next morning before dawn. The porter looked surprised, but offered no protest. The air was wet, heavy with the residue of yesterday's rain. The chapel stood silent, unlit, its windows pale as sleep. I climbed the narrow stair to the organ loft and examined the ropes again. One still bore that faint sheen of oil at the knot's base. Beside it, I noticed a small ledger hung on a now an old maintenance record, each entry written in the same compact script. I flipped through the pages absently until I reached the most recent one. Adjustment to campana tertia, due to uneven resonance, restored to proper sequence. The date was 3 days before Bryce's death. Signed with initials, I recognized only after several seconds, H.B. Helena. Bryce. She had altered the bells herself. I sat on the wooden step and listened as the first light crept through the east window. If Bryce had arranged for the bells to ring incorrectly, she had done so intentionally, perhaps as proof of something, perhaps as protection. I thought of her torn diary page, the one she had removed with such precision, a confession disguised as a mission. Lewis arrived mid-morning, cheerful, hopeful that we might close the foil. He told me the choir mistress had resigned, her letter brief and unadorned. He saw it as confirmation. I said nothing. I had begun to suspect that the entire melody we'd been following, the poem, the bells, and the scholarship, was an orchestration designed to draw our ears away from the true discord. That afternoon, the dean hosted a memorial for Dr. Bryce. The college choir sang her chosen hymn. The sound was exquisite, balanced, unerring. And yet, as the final chord echoed under the high roof, I heard something faint and overtone, a fraction late, almost human in its imperfection. No one else seemed to notice. I watched the dean lower his head, his expression unreadable. When the service ended, I lingered near the door, waiting for him to meet my eyes. He did not. Back home, I filled the crossword half-heartedly. False cadence 8. I wrote a resolution and immediately crossed it out. Not every ending deserved one. For now, we had our culprit, our confession, our harmony restored. And yet, as I closed my notebook, I knew with the dull certainty of habit that it was all wrong. The case was finished. The truth was not. It was raining again, that delicate, non-committal sort of drizzle Oxford favours, enough to persuade you to carry an umbrella, never enough to justify opening it. Lewis complained about the weather, about the paperwork, about the college's refusal to release its full financial accounts. I told him that the weather, like deceit, was rarely improved by transparency. We sat together in my office, the hum of the radiator offering its half-hearted warmth. The file on Dr. Bryce lay open before us, its pages swollen slightly from the damp air. Lewis pointed to the bursar's statement, neatly typed and profoundly dull. "Everything in order," he said, as though boredom could be mistaken for proof. I took the paper from him and turned it sideways, reading the Latin subheadings the way one reads an old inscription, searching for mischief in the margins. There, near the bottom of a column, was an annotation of 3 words in the bursar's own hand, campana revocata est. The bell rang. The phrase stirred something. I'd seen it once before in a line of the poem, or perhaps in one of the college's archives. I told Lewis to fetch the ledgers. He sighed, muttered something about my fondness for dead languages, and left to charm the librarian. While he was gone, I poured a small whiskey. Outside, the streetlights blurred in the rain like smudged punctuation. I thought of Helena Bryce, of her diary with its absent page, of the letter quoting Browning bells that warn, not mourn. Somewhere between warning and mourning lies confession. Oxford is full of such shades. Lewis returned half an hour later with 2 ledgers, both older than either of us had a right to be handling. We opened them at the bursar's entries. The handwriting was consistent until, quite suddenly, it wasn't. Halfway through the volume, the script shifted neater, tighter, a hand that had learned to hide itself. The change coincided precisely with the month Bryce had begun her investigation. It was there, in that careful Latin, that I found the truth beginning to whisper. Under the scholarship accounts, a subscript line written so faintly it could be mistaken for ink bleeding through the page donum ad finem vitae, a gift until the end of life. I translated aloud, more for myself than for Lewis. He frowned, asking if it referred to a pension. I shook my head. The phrase was personal, not institutional, a private endowment, one that expired with death. I traced the ink with my finger. The bursar's pen had pressed harder here, as though reluctant to commit the lie. When I turned the page, another hand had signed off the balance sheet differently again, looser, as if written in haste. The name beneath it was not the bursar's, but the dean's. I remembered the photograph then of the young dean standing beside Bryce and the vanished poet, Arthur Latham. The missing 4th figure is half in shadow. The dean had inherited not only the college, but the silence it required. I said as much to Lewis, who looked unconvinced. We went back to St. Fridswide's before dusk. The porter let us in without question this time. Word of the investigation had spread, and with it the polite dread that accompanies scandal. In the bursar's office, the air smelt of damp wool and cold tea. I pulled open the bottom drawer of his cabinet and found, tucked beneath a stack of outdated invoices, a notebook bound in cracked leather. Inside were copied sections of the same ledger entries, each line rewritten, but with one crucial addition. At the top of the page, Helena Bryce Honorarium deferred. Deferred. Not cancelled. Lewis stared at the word as though it might confess. He said it proved the dean's guilt, that he had redirected the funds through the trust and killed her when she discovered it. Perhaps he was right, but something still refused to align. I asked him to read the last entry aloud. He did so, awkwardly campana revocata, then, more quietly, sed vox mane. The bell is recalled, but the voice remains. We stood in silence. The bells outside began to toll, muffled by the rain. 6 chimes, steady, unerring, yet even through the sound, I could hear a delay, an echo out of phase, as though another, smaller bell had answered from somewhere within the walls. Lewis said it was imagination. I didn't argue. Back at my flat, I opened my notebook and wrote one line before closing it again. The bell was recalled but not forgiven. It was near dawn when the truth arrived, not as revelation, but as fatigue. I'd spent the night rereading the ledgers, the diaries, and that infernal poem. The rain had stopped hours ago, though the streets still held its reflection. From my window, I could see the faint light behind St. Fridswide's tower. The bells were silent. For once, Oxford seemed unwilling to explain itself. By morning, I'd decided. Lewis looked surprised when I told him to meet me at the college. He asked whether I meant to arrest the dean. I said I meant to ask him one more question, which in Oxford amounts to the same thing. We found him in the chapel, seated near the altar, as though waiting for absolution that would never quite arrive. The air smelt of extinguished candles that mingled scent of wax and confession. He greeted us with tired civility. I told him we'd found the second ledger, the one hidden under the bursar's files. He nodded once, as if that too had been inevitable. He said that Dr. Bryce had misunderstood him, that she had discovered figures taken out of context. He spoke in that calm, practiced way that sounds like truth until you listen too closely. Lewis asked about the phrase campana revocata. The dean's expression flickered a momentary grief that might have been a memory. He said it was an old line from Latham's unfinished poem, the one Helena had cherished. She believed it meant something more than metaphor. I watched him carefully then, the slight tremor in his hand as he traced the edge of the pew. I asked him whether he remembered the night she died, the bells, the reversed chime, the hymn she'd chosen. His gaze shifted upward to the tower. He said the bells had always been her obsession, that she'd thought they could measure truth in sound. I told him they'd been altered, not by her, but after her death. He didn't answer. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then, softly, he said that some silences are mercy. Lewis looked at me, waiting for certainty. I had none to offer. We walked the narrow stair to the bell chamber together. The air was cold and thick with dust, the ropes hanging in stillness. I noticed again the third bell, the one long, cracked, long silent. Its surface bore a faint smudge of polish, newer than the others. The dean's eyes followed mine. He said it had been repaired recently, a small miracle of restoration. I asked who had paid for it. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and touched the metal with something almost tender. He said Helena had wanted the bell to ring again, that she'd believed the college needed to remember. And when she learned the truth about the scholarship, about the money hidden behind Latin euphemism, she had threatened to make that memory public. He paused. Then, in a voice that seemed not his own, he said he had only meant to delay her announcement, that she had taken more of the medicine than prescribed. She'd told him she felt her heart slowing, and asked him not to call the porter. He looked at me then, his eyes empty of pretense. I realized he wanted me to hate him, or perhaps to forgive him. I could do neither. We left him there, alone with his ghosts and the unringing bell. Outside, the morning had sharpened into brightness. Lewis said we should call it in, that there would be a statement, a hearing, perhaps even sympathy. I told him to wait until noon. He didn't argue. He's learned that my silences are rarely open to appeal. By midday, the college courtyard filled with quiet activity students, unaware of the scandal blooming in their midst. A small crowd gathered near the chapel as workmen climbed to the tower. There was talk of testing the restored bell for the first time since its repair. The dean stood below, head bowed. When the first strike came, it faltered, a hollow clang, too light, too uncertain. The second never followed. A mechanism jammed, perhaps, or something more deliberate. The bell that would not ring. Lewis muttered that it was fitting. I nodded. But as the workers descended, I thought I heard, faintly, a second tone rising from within the tower, not a bell, but its echo, the memory of what should have been sound. That night, back in my flat, I poured the last of the whiskey. The case was finished. The paperwork would say heart failure, financial impropriety, and tragedy, but I kept hearing that faint, unstruck note of silence shaped like the truth. I wrote one final line before closing the file. The bell was never meant to ring again, only to remind those who listened of what silence costs.